Right, rook and pawn versus rook and the vertical cutoff. Very painful experience for me, this the opening to this video. This is one of my games from the Major Open in the British Championships this year, and I'm white and I'm about to play a very, very bad move. I'm not quite sure what possessed me to play this very, very bad move, but I played it, and then the reason I've chosen to show this game is that it leads into a lost rook and pawn versus rook endgame, which my opponent played absolutely perfectly. So what possessed me to play bishop takes a7? I really don't know. I was well aware at this stage I can take the pawn with the rook, or I can take it with the bishop. I mean, all sorts of sensible things went through my head along the lines of, like, well, if I take with the bishop, then knight c6 forks the rook and the bishop. We're going to get a rook ending if black wants it. And my thought process just sort of stopped there. I'm not quite sure why, because it doesn't take long to assess that that rook ending is lost. And so it wasn't like I didn't see knight c6. I saw it and then just played bishop takes a7 anyway. Kind of like a moth being drawn to a light bulb or something. And intellectually speaking, I was probably about as clever as a moth when I played this next move. And the other thing is that if you keep the bishop and the knight on, you know, when you're losing a game, you want to swap pawns, not pieces. Especially, I mean, if you think of it, like, one of the worst case scenarios there is that I might end up sacking the bishop for one of those two pawns and having a rook and knight versus a rook, which theoretically is a drawn position. So, moment of madness, and I took with the bishop and my opponent very sensibly. My opponent, who I massively outgraded, played this game extremely well. He just finished this ending off. I think that was one of the things that made me take with the bishop, is that I just thought I could draw the rook ending. It was almost like I didn't believe he was going to convert it so expertly. But he did. So anyway, learning curve for me, that one. And, you know, I mean, I deliberated, do I really want to make a sort of a publicly viewed video where everyone can see, and I sort of admit that I played such a bad move. Well, if we're going to learn from our mistakes, we need to think about what went through our head or what didn't go through our head at the time we made those mistakes, and just try and work out why. I don't think I have worked out why I played that move yet. Probably the pain from it still sort of stopped me thinking about it, because it wasn't like I didn't have the knowledge in my head to assess that this is a completely lost rook ending. My opponent then sensibly brought his king towards where the pawns are, and the plan at some point for black is very simple. The rook's going to come back and challenge this cutting off of the king, so that the king can then just march into the position. Excuse me. And I can't swap the rooks because the pawn ending's lost. So what does white do? It's lost. I probably should have tried a move I try in a minute anyway. I should have just tried it now. But it doesn't really do very much. F4. Although black has to take that. There's only one winning move for black here, and it is to take that pawn. But taking that pawn is a win. I mean, if I come back with a rook, the king's in, so I have to sort of keep the king cut off. But my king's cut off from coming towards that pawn. And here black can either just play rook d7 straight away. I can't swap rooks because that's still a lost king and pawn ending. And black doesn't need to worry about the f-pawn. You know, that's going to lead to a position similar to what we're about to see in the game. Or instead of offering the rook swap straight away, we could see a king move. I don't think white's got anything better here than just a waiting move, and we'll see a similar sort of position. So, I mean, I could have tried that, but given how well my opponent played this, I don't think it would have got me very far. I mean, I'll play it in a minute anyway. King c3, rook d7. I bring the rook back to a4. So at least when I play the f4 move, I mean, I can take that back straight away. It's still completely won for black to take that pawn. But king e6 is also winning, so long as when I take on e5, this is where black has the chance to mess it up. But like I say, my opponent played this extremely well and didn't mess it up. If black takes back with the pawn, then what we have there, and just see that position on the board, what we have here is a vertical cut-off where the king's cut off by 1 file. Now, as long as this pawn hasn't crossed the 4th rank, that's a draw. If it has crossed the 4th rank, if you move like the entire chessboard, all the pieces down, that would still be a win, just from that 1 file vertical cutoff. 1 file vertical cutoff is not enough if the pawn's still on the 4th rank. It is enough, however, if the pawn's on the 4th rank and there's a 2 file vertical cutoff. If I could somehow magically get my rook in the right place now, there might be drawing chances. If I could get my rook magically to e1 check. Now I think I might be drawing that still because this pawn is still back on the 3rd rank. But you can see that I'm not going to be able to stop that pawn getting to the 4th rank, at which point it's just a win. So rook a1, f5, I played rook e1 check, king f6, rook f1. My defensive technique here, by the way, was pretty good. It is the defensive technique you should use when you're cut off by 1 file. But it doesn't really matter that it was pretty good because it was useless. You can't defend this if black knows what they're doing, which my opponent did. My opponent did know what they were doing. Much to my annoyance. I was amazed actually how well he played it. I really was. I thought he's going to make a mistake in a minute. He's not going to know just how to convert this, because I've played this this position down the club, sort of trying to help people master it because I know it inside out, and people have struggled to remember what to do. And he didn't just do it effortlessly. He did it sort of quickly as well. He just bashed out the moves. Very, very annoying. Never mind. Now, if the king was cut off by 2 files against a knight's pawn, then as long as I took a bit of care, I could draw that. So it's winning here for black, unfortunately, with a bishop's pawn. If it was a knight's pawn or a rook's pawn, and the king was cut off by 2 files, it's a draw. Okay. Rook's pawn's very easy to draw. As an interesting aside, I'm talking about the king being cut off by 2 files. If it's a rook's pawn and the rook's still here, like the king's cut off by 4 files, then that's going to lead to a win for black. And as long as the pawn's sort of far forward enough, I'm going to cover that in a completely separate video. But in this position here, with the pawn on the 4th rank, if it's a knight's pawn or a rook's pawn and the king's cut off by 2 files, it's just a draw. This is a win, as you're about to see. This would be a win. This is also a win if the king's cut off by 2 files, so the white king would actually be on a3 in this position. But the technique you're about to see wouldn't work in that particular case. Black would need to use a different winning technique. Anyway, let's see that winning technique now. It's called the Grigoriev combined method, and my opponent just played it to perfection. I've got my king in a pretty sensible place here, because my king can't cross the d file, and black wants to keep that as the case to stop my king getting into the action. So the rook has to keep guarding the d file. If the rook comes to d5 to defend the pawn, I will hassle it, and I will force it to either relinquish control of the f-pawn, defense of the f-pawn, or relinquish control of the d file. So that makes things difficult for black, because they've got to try and work out how can I get my king up the board, sort of thing. How do I come and attack your rook while simultaneously you're going to be attacking this pawn? So if you're not going to let my king cross the d file, your rook's kind of out of commission in terms of the safety of this pawn, and that's the defensive technique that would work if it was 1 file. Let's see that. So king g5, and my plan is I'm going to check king h4 and come back and hit the f-pawn. So what white's sort of saying here is you can't come and attack my rook, because every time you try and do it, I'm going to hit the f-pawn. And you can't defend the f-pawn with your rook unless you let my king come across, or you try and do it on this rank, and then I hit your rook. And you can't maintain control of the d-file and the 5th rank at the same time. I guess that's why it's argument. So what does black do? Well, they defend the pawn here. Say, right, check, king h3, and now I'll do the same again. And at this point, this h3 is the best square that black can possibly reach. And any attempt to now defend this pawn is just going to go around in circles. But yeah, this is as far forward as the black king can reach, but it's good enough because now we can let the white king cross the d-file. As it happens, in this particular position, because my king's not on c4, you could argue the king being on c4 would be an even better place. Rook d5 would actually be winning here for black as well. I could hit the rook across to a5, hit it again, rook to e5, and it's going to take me 2 moves to attack the black rook, and in the meantime black's king is going to attack on g2. You can see that particular winning maneuver becomes more problematic as this pawn shifts this way, because the attack on the rook with the king could keep happening back and forth. You've got to be a little bit careful as the attacking side that if your rook was on the 3rd rank, we'll see an example of this later on, then the winning method my opponent now played, which is just to put the rook behind the pawn, that wouldn't work. So if the rook had gone to f6 there, white does now draw with king d4. Okay, I'll show you an example of that later on. But rook f7, I'm stuffed. I went king d2, and here we see king g2. Rook desperately tries to stay on the pawn, king g3. And if I bring my rook back, f4, the pawn's going to advance. So I put my rook over to the side. I'm basically sort of politely playing the defense side that it talks about in the textbooks, to be honest. Maybe I should have tried something different because it was obvious my opponent knew what he was doing. But it's completely lost. f4, I desperately try and get my king to f1. But black says, you're not doing that. I go back with the rook, check, and I don't think we need to see much more of this, to be honest. The Lucena position is going to be reached. I played a few more moves, we got into the Lucena position, and as soon as my opponent played rook to the 4th rank, that was enough to convince me that he knew exactly what he was doing, and I just resigned. So that's how you win rook and pawn versus rook if the king is cut off by 2 files. Like I say, very, very painful for me to go through that. Why did I play bishop takes a7? I have no idea. Okay, I think what makes it worse is that I saw knight c6, he gets to swap, we're going to rook ending, and it was like my brain just sort of stopped there. Like I say, a bit like a moth in the heading towards the light. I sort of saw it was bad and just sort of went towards it anyway. Weird. Right, let's look at some games. So the example I just showed was from a game that I played where my king was cut off by 2 files. And most of the time that's a win. When I described the various situations that it would be a draw. If the king's cut off by 1 file, it is going to be a draw as long as the defending side, black in this particular case, gets their king and rook into the right defensive setup. And although I played that horrendous bishop takes a7 move in the first move you saw in the last position and got myself into a losing endgame, I did actually play the defensive side of that lost endgame pretty well. And that was the correct way to defend it and would have worked if it was just 1 file cut off. So that would work here for the player with the black pieces. This is a game from 2001. It's actually Shirov playing black. And just to sort of show you how hard some of this stuff is, Shirov had obviously forgotten how you do this and didn't play the right move here. Okay, so we're going to see a vertical cutoff by 1 file. White's offering the swap of rooks, which black, of course, cannot accept. That's completely a lost pawn endgame. So the black rook has to move. The question is where? Shirov played rook c6, and now this is losing for black. Okay. What needed to be played was rook c8. Then you'd see the vertical cutoff, and black's got a choice here, but it's really just the next two moves that need playing. The king into a sensible place, and then rook to g8 check. Those are the moves that need to be played. So if we see king d6, the rook pops back on the e-file, vertical cutoff, but yeah, rook g8 check, you just start those series of checks, and it's going to be a draw. Because when the white king gets to h6 and finally defends the pawn with rook to f1, this king's just already close enough to the action. It's going to be a draw. So that would have worked as a draw. Instead, Shirov played rook c6, vertical cutoff, and then he sort of desperately tried to get his rook into the right place. It's too late to come back now with rook c8, because white can play, there's lots of winning moves, but a very sensible one is rook e4, because it's going to take two moves for that rook to be harassed, and we're defending the pawn laterally, which is going to give this king freedom to, on the zigzags come up and attack. Basically, the f-pawn's going to get one square further on, and if it's a one-file vertical cutoff and the pawn's on the 5th rank, then it's just a win, because the king can deal with the rook, can attack the rook and defend its pawn at the same time. That's the key. In fact, we'll probably see that here. Rook g8 check, king h5, rook f8, king g6, and yeah, you can see we're going to get to f5 with the pawn. Shirov instead tried rook g6 check, king f5, rook to g8, and I mean, rook e4 works again, the same idea, come back and defend the pawn. But in the game, another idea that you can do is once your king's in front of the pawn, if you're allowed just that one extra move, like if it was black to move, black could deliver a check. But if you've got that one extra move and your king's in front of the pawn already, you can bring your rook up and it's going to act as a block here. Which is exactly what happened in the game. There was a bit of sort of messing around in the game now. Some very resilient defending. And a bit of going around in circles going on. Some back rank stuff was being threatened there. King to g7, rook h5. Probably the simplest way to win from here is just come back and hit the rook. So when it drops back, the pawn advances. But white instead chose to defend the pawn. Black then pinned the pawn. It's like rook e4 check, king back to g6, rook g4 check, king f5. So yeah, not exactly the most convincing execution, but it's always been one for white at any stage in all of these positions. Finally, the f-pawn comes forward. A bit more, I guess, desperate defending now, really. And after a few more moves in that position there, black finally resigned. Right, next, this is a game from 1992. Very similar to what we've just seen. You could pause the video and work out what would you do here as black. Michael Adams is actually white in this one. Black has only one drawing move. And unfortunately for Michael Adams, his opponent found it and defended this position extremely well. It was just drawn, trivially drawn in 5 moves time. In fact, it was trivially drawn in about 3 or 4 moves time. And Adams just swapped the rooks, because it was rather than off a draw, just swap rooks, as we're about to see. So what should you do? I mean, you can see with this that if you don't know what you're doing, very natural moves, like rook behind the pawn, they lose. There's your vertical cutoff. I mean, what does black try? Put their king in. The rook can drop back, so the g-pawn's ready to advance. We might see a check. Rook back to h8. Okay, we've got a choice here. We can either play rook f4 or rook f6 check would have worked again, that idea. Sort of giving us a block. Rook f4, what does black do? We could come and hassle the rook. Then you could play rook f6. Or if rook g8 check, the pawn's defended. So if the king hassles the rook now, it can just sort of disappear off on the fourth rank. Rook h8 check, king g7, rook b8, the pawn's going forward. So yeah, rook d1 does lose it. But black realised that the correct defensive setup, if you're playing against this one file vertical cutoff, is you've got to attack the pawn from in front and be ready to deliver all those checks. Rook d8, rook f5, there's the vertical cutoff. A couple of moves could draw it from here. I mean, there's two things you need to play really. One's rook h8 and the other one is king e6. So king e6 would lead to a draw. Keep hassling the rook and then the king's in. Or, as played in the game, rook h8 check, king g5, rook g8 check, king hides on f4. And now in the game, black played a move that they couldn't play when the king was still on h4, which is to offer this exchange of rooks. And the point is that if white doesn't do anything about that, then black will be able to exchange the rooks, being careful about taking the opposition. Or if white moves their rook away, the king's ready to come along to the g file, possibly even g8, and then we're all ready for back rank defence, aren't we? If the rooks stay on, that is. Adams knew all of this and just thought, let's have a draw. And they agreed to draw there. Yeah, the one move to sort of really note in the middle of all that was at this stage here, notice, because black's just one move away, this was in the losing variation, where rook d1 was the first move, black's just sort of one move off getting it all set up. If black plays king e5, kind of trying to hassle the rook, we've got rook f6, because the king's got that one extra tempo, the king's come in front of the pawn, we're now ready for this block. You're kind of transforming a vertical cutoff into a horizontal cutoff, which I need to cover in another video. But yeah, that's worth noting. Next, this is a game from 1987. It is black to play. Pause the video and decide what would you do. So I meant to give you choices actually there, was either king f3 or king f5. Now, where king f3 leads, I think is very hard to assess. At the very least, all we can see is it leads into a very unusual position. Assessing whether that unusual position is one for white or a draw for black is very hard. What I'm going to claim is that the move played in the game, king f5, I don't think it takes that long to analyse a reasonably forcing variation after king f5, and if you've got good knowledge of the vertical cutoff situation, you can see that position is lost, and therefore you never should have played king f5. Now, it's all very easy to say in retrospect. I guess what we're trying to achieve is, like, when we get this position in games in the future, we've got the knowledge in our head. You've got to combine the knowledge of where this position's about to go to in 4 or 5 moves' time with the ability to calculate it to that position that you have the knowledge to know that it's a draw or it's a loss or whatever. So let's see those forcing moves, then you can decide whether or not you agree with me. I mean, if you agree with me, great. If you disagree with me, then I guess we're back to, in this position, king f5, king f3. Well, I don't know. Just try one of them, to be honest, because I can't calculate it 4 or 5 moves down the line and then have the knowledge. It's just too much for me. I mean, those are the choices, right? We either just don't know and just see what happens. We just sort of play to feel. Or we get to a position like this and we actually try and calculate it all the way to a bit where we could know that was a loss. Anyway, king f5, the forcing variation, I mean, rook f1 check is obviously a move that white can play. It takes you off the g-pawn, which white can then take. And then you would think, well, king e6 is surely the most sensible square. And then you see rook takes h2. What would white do in this position? Okay, you might have been thinking that before you played king f5. Well, the king's already cut off and we want to advance our g-pawn. So I can't see any move more natural than king g5. is a very obvious move. Okay, at which point you think, okay, vertical cut off one file, rook back to h8, great, I've got my king and rook in the right place. And who knows, maybe the player with the black pieces thought along those lines. The move that we need to see, though, that busts that defence, and this I would concede is maybe a hard one to spot back in the original position. But if you remember that in that Adams game from a minute ago, I said we're sort of one move ahead of the curve because our king had come in front of the pawns on g4 in that particular case. It meant that we could transform the vertical cutoff into a horizontal cutoff, or it meant we could stick our rook in front of the king to block the checks. You know, that's what white's going to be thinking. Rook back to h8. Oh no, black's going to play rook g8. I need some way to block it. Well, in this position, it's very obvious what white needs to do. But could you see this position before you played king f5? Because like I say, it's all pretty forcing up until now. And you say, well, I play rook h8. Has white got anything there, or have I basically just achieved a drawing position? And then you look at, right, what moves has white got? They want to get their rook in front of the king. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying a player of my level is capable of calculating that. Push the g-pawn. And yeah, we can't then calculate the rest of it from there. This is where the knowledge steps in, and we're like, well, actually, I know that's a loss, to be honest now, because I can't do the barrage of checks, because if I do, the rook steps in front. This is how the game went, by the way. And we can see that very soon white's going to be able to advance that g-pawn. So therefore, I won't play king f5 in the original position. I don't know, up to you whether you agree with me or disagree with me on that is a possible level of chess to get to. And I'm not sure where we go if I'm wrong on that, because it's just a case of, well, just king f3, king f5, I don't know, play one of them and see what happens. It's like, well, I just don't think we're going to get very far in the long run, are we, if we do that? Anyway, let's see how this game ended. Rook a8, rook g7 check. King f8, you've got to be very careful with moves like that. When this king's attached to this rook, and I'm playing king h6, I mean, I presume white dotted the i's and crossed the t's, but obviously rook a6 check, you're like, okay. You could have played rook back to g6, I suppose, or king h7 to not lose the rook. Both were actually winning as well. Rook attacks the pawn, and again, I'm getting very nervous about the king being attached to the rook. If black could magically play rook takes g5 check at this point, or if the black king was on h8, does rook h6 check force the issue? I think it might do, actually. Not sure. But you have king f7. But those are the sorts of things I'm looking at stalemate themes. I'm looking at as long as this king's attached to this rook, I'm looking out for checks and other disasters. So I presume white had to be careful and was careful of that all the way through. In the game, rook g4 was played here. More natural probably would be just swing the rook over here. And that actually invites a blunder from white. This is a knight's pawn, and we're not that far off back rank defence at this point. So white could blunder here with an intermezzo silly check, to be honest. And now black's going to achieve back rank defence. That'd be a very easy draw from there. As it is after rook a4, white can just play rook b7. We might see check, and yeah, and this g-pawn's coming through. We're going to get to the Lucena position very shortly after that one. In fact, I think it's pretty much this position that, or close to this position I used to demonstrate the Lucena position, where checkmate's being threatened, so the king has to pop out onto the long side. And I don't know why rook g8 was played there. I would have just played king h6. Just leave this rook here, it's in a good place. So I think that's enough on vertical cutoff by one file, as a bit of a hint as to what's going on in this next position. So this is white to play. This is a game from 1998. I think this is quite an easy one, given what we've already discussed. And that first game where my opponent perfectly outplayed, just perfectly finished me off in that end game. He really did play it flawlessly. Did I mention that I was annoyed? I think I might have done. What would you do here? There's only one winning move, but it's a fairly obvious one, especially as it's featuring in a video, the title of which is Vertical Cutoff. So rook d5, that cuts the king off by 2 files. Drop the rook back. It doesn't have to go to d3, but remember that the vertical cutoff by 2 files only works if the pawn's already on the 4th rank. So this rook defending the pawn is going to be very helpful to give our king freedom to move and be able to move that pawn to the 4th rank. The other winning move from this point is rook to d8, and the idea there is that the black would have to come and do the frontal defense 1 rank further down, which is like rank 7 to a 3rd rank pawn is the same distance as rank 8 to the 4th rank pawn. I haven't checked out the details, but the engine's saying rook d8 is also a win. I presume it's that. Apologies if I've got that wrong. But rook d3, far more sensible move. Just defend that pawn. Black defended this pretty well though, gave white lots of chances to go wrong, including now, rook h1. And rook h1 is very clever, because if you prematurely push this f-pawn, this is now a draw, and black can play rook h2 check. If the king goes up to the 3rd rank, we would check, take the rook, and play king d5, and that's a drawn king and pawn ending. So the king would have to come back to the 1st rank. That is not good at all. And then you just come and hit the pawn. The king can't defend it. If the rook defends it, our king's getting across. And if the rook defends it like that, our king attacks the rook. And then either the pawn's going or the king's getting across. So that would blunder the game away, or blunder the win away into a draw. In the game, white was wise to these tricks and played king f2. Just, in the end game, do not hurry. You saw in that game, the first position where my opponent, I was just stuffed right from the start. My king was cut off. I couldn't get it back in the game. I couldn't offer a swap of rooks because the pawn ending was lost. I just couldn't do anything. So he didn't have to hurry, and he played it very well. And it's the same here. Do not hurry. Rook h3, king g2, rook back to h8, and now f4. Okay, get that pawn up to the 4th rank, and now we're going to see the Grigoriev combined method. Rook d4, king c5, bit of messing around, I'm not quite sure why. Not sure what the messing around was for. I don't know why the rook came back to d3 either. This was a very bad place to put this rook, because it gave white a chance to go wrong in a minute. Much better to just bring it back to the 1st rank, or even the 2nd rank, which is, I think, where my opponent in that game had his rook. 7th rank, because he was black. And here we see the Grigoriev combined methods. And then at this stage, this is where, well, usually you'd have a choice. My opponent in that game had a choice between bringing their rook behind the pawn, which is what he did, or he could have brought the rook to the 4th rank. I've got a feeling if the black king was already on c5, this might even be a draw with the rook on the 3rd rank. I'd need to double check that. But what I do know is in this position, this rook f3 doesn't work, because the rook's too close to the pawn. So king d5, you attack the rook again, but in this position, black's got king e4. If the rook was back on f2, this check immediately swaps rooks. Or if it was back on f1, this check immediately wins the black rook. Swapping rooks win the black rook, doesn't matter. White's won. But here, white's just got nothing. I mean, the last little trick they might try is this. Do not take the rook, but you take the pawn. And if you carry on, well, now we can take the rooks. Okay, you can do that. So rook f3 would lead to a draw, but in the game rook d4 was played. The rook got hit, rook a4. and we wouldn't really need to waste time with king b5 and rook e4, because the black king can't attack the rook before the white rook's attacked the black one. So yeah, king d6, desperately trying to get the king back, and yeah, we're going to see a conversion very similar to, well, black actually resigned there because the Lucena position is on the way. So quick reminder, I mean, I think I said, let's just go back to the point where it's round about here, isn't it? So the Grigoriev combined method basically starts about here. King's cut off by 2 files, we've got our pawn on the 4th rank. Now, if this pawn was a knight's pawn, it's a draw, because we wouldn't have enough space to do the Grigoriev combined method. You just have to be a bit careful that if the white rook's up here, this king hassles it to get it back down this end of the board, and then it would be a draw by that defensive technique. Rook's pawn would also be a draw, king cut off by 2 files. If you move the pawn one further this way, the win's still the same, using the same method. So e-pawn, move everything on the chessboard 1 square this way, it's still a win. If you move everything on the chessboard 2 squares this way, it is still a win, but not using the same method. The same method wouldn't work, and you'll need a different method based on the fact that the black king is stuck to the edge of the board. It's actually quite a good fun winning method. It's worth spending some time thinking about. So it's white to play. Pause the video if you like and see if you can come up with how you'd go about winning this. Another thing you could do actually is see if you can work out why the pawn being so far this way means the standard trick of bringing our king to c6 and then shifting the rook behind the pawn, why that doesn't work. Why doesn't that work in this particular case? Have a think about that as well. So let's go through the attempt to win it using the method we've already seen and why it doesn't work here. So king d4, check, and we go through all the checks, come back and hit the e-pawn, and then white defends the e-pawn from behind. Now this is the bit where white comes in. Black just plays gets their king in because the white rooks relinquish control of the 2 file cut off. The black king starts coming in. This is the bit where the white king comes in and attacks the black rook, and we'd see rook e5, king d6, and oh dear, what does black do? Well, I think even that's still a draw actually, because then black can do the same thing that they can do now, which is long-sided defense. The reason it doesn't work is because there's just so much space over here for the black rook to fire in checks. So that's why it doesn't work. The 2 file cut off, it doesn't work for the rook's pawn or the knight's pawn. It does work for the bishop's pawn, as we've seen in a couple of games. It would work for the queen's pawn. It also, the Grigoriev combined method doesn't work for the king's pawn, but it is still going to be a win. We've got to go back and do a different winning method, although it's too late now. We've actually messed this up. So what do we do? Well, this king being on h5 is actually very annoying. We kind of want the king to be either on h6 or on h4. Either of those 2 squares, and we have mating, checkmate threat trickery that's going to get us the 1 extra tempo that we need. Because the problem is, for example, when the white king's on c6, or even f6 in this case that we're thinking of in advance, we have to do something about the fact this pawn's hit. That's the problem that we've got. But if checkmate's threatened, that's going to give us the 1 extra tempo. So this king being on h5 is actually an annoying square. So an opening move would just be a waiting move, rook g2. If the black king goes to h6, we can immediately start advancing our king up the board. Okay, so let's just see that, for example. King h6, and we just start throwing our king up the board. And there's the trick. Okay, we don't have to go king f5. We can just go king f6 straight away, and checkmate is being threatened. Black has to deal with that, but as soon as they deal with it, then we've got king to e7, and we're going to be getting our pawn up the board with the one extra square that we need to get it up the board, and that's completely won. So after rook g2, black doesn't play king h6. They play king h4, and now you kind of got a similar thing going on in that king f4 is going to threaten a checkmate, but you don't really want to threaten a checkmate here. That's not going to do anything, because we just see a bunch of checks. I mean, it is one of the winning moves, but it's not going to get anywhere. It doesn't make progress. What you want to do here, but don't want to do here, is you want to push the e-pawn. Rook takes e5, and then you play king f4, simultaneously threatening the checkmate, but also attacking the black rook. Okay, so let's just see how that would work. e5, rook takes e5, king f4. What does black even do? Well, I'll tell you what they do. They attack your rook. Oops. Okay, so it was the right idea, but your rook was too close. If the rook had been on g1, pushing the e-pawn would have worked. Okay, so you just have to do a little triangulation. Rook g2, king h4, rook up to g7, king h5, and now rook back to g1. You've basically got back to the original position with black to move. If king h4, you can push the e-pawn, and now this would be a disaster. You've won. If king h6, then I think we've already seen this line, haven't we? We can zigzag our way up the board, but we don't need to we don't need to defend the f-pawn. Sure, we can play king f6 straight away there. We can. Yeah, I'm not sure what king f5 is for in this example line. Bizarre. So we could have played king f6 a minute ago. I'm not sure why we had to get to f6. I thought was better that way. But we decided to go there the more extravagant way. And yeah, black has to deal with the checkmate threat. And we've transposed to... where are we? See if I can find the position. Somewhere around there, basically. I mean, the rook on g1 or g2 doesn't make too much difference. We've transposed to that line, haven't we? So yeah, if the king's cut off by 2 files, it's basically 1 for all combinations except for knight's pawn and rook's pawn. And you can't have the king cut off by 2 files over there, because that would take the black king off the board. Right, 2 more positions to look at. This is a game from 1989. It's white to play, and white has only 1 winning move. Pause the video and see if you can work out what it is. We've got the king cut off by 2 files, but we haven't got our pawn to the 4th rank yet, which means that we're going to need 1 move's worth of freedom for our king to come and harass the black rook if necessary. But we can't start marching our king up the board, attacking rooks, if it means the rook can just come and take our pawn. Is there any way to defend this pawn whilst maintaining control of the e-file in a way that's not necessarily going to last forever, but is going to give us that 1 move of freedom we need to get our pawn to c4? Well, when you phrase the question like that, yes, rook e3. Only winning move. Well done if you found it. Rook d8 check, king to c2. Oh no, king f7. If black goes back to c8 with the rook, then the king can just come and hassle the rook. We're going to probably get some interference going on in a sec as well. Some sort of check and over here going on. Let's see if we can... There you go, there's a check. Oh, there you go, check, check, and c7. Excellent. So, yeah, king f7. And we're going to see something pretty similar. So it's not quite as simple as I said, actually, is it? Because black can sort of shuffle back and forth on the c-file, but we do need to use this interference trick. But the point is that by defending the pawn, the black king couldn't attack our rook in time to stop our king having freedom to come up the board and attack the rook, which is essentially what's led us to this interference idea. And you can see that the pawn is now going to advance with our king in front of it. This is going to lead to the Lucena position pretty shortly. These are the games that actually happened in this. These are the moves that actually happened in this 1989 game, and black resigned there. That's a nice move, isn't it? Rook h7. This pawn is, of course, poisoned. Check, check, picking up the rook. One more. A similar sort of thing going on. It's black to play. Pause the video and decide what would you do to win this. And the first move should have just been sort of screaming at you, really. Sort of vertical cut-off. King's cut off by 2 files. The king comes and hits that rook. In the game, it disappeared to e1. I don't think it had to disappear to e1. Could just go back to e8 straight away. It does. King comes back. And rook back to e6. Did it have to go to... I mean, it can actually go back to e8 as well, because there's not really anything stopping this pawn coming forward. But back to e6, fine. Rook h1, and then the pawn comes forward. Yeah, I don't think we need it. In fact, the rook being on the third rank, remember, is not necessarily a great idea if the king was here, because we had that extra trick of it not being... Yeah, it's a little tip to the defender, actually. If the guy doing the Grigoriev combined method on you has their attacking rook on this rank, it might be worth just sort of shuffling your king here, hoping that they blunder it away in a minute to this king e4 idea. Because the idea is that when the black king comes and attacks your rook, you play rook c4 and then king to d5, defending your rook and attacking theirs, and there's a draw. I've shown that earlier on. But yeah, once the rook's on e6, I would probably be pushing it back a bit, actually, before I started on the Grigoriev combined method. I mean, in fact, rook e8 is actually the engine's top move, or it's just changed to rook e4, which makes even less sense to me, but fine. I mean, the fact is that this king's miles away from attacking a lateral defence of this c-pawn, so black just got on with it in the game and did the Grigoriev combined method. Even here, rook c6 is okay, isn't it? Because white can't play king e4. But if the white king was on f3, I'm pretty sure I'm right in thinking that rook c6 would be blundering away the win to king e4. Okay. But here rook e5 was played, and yeah, that's just a win. Let me just do two silly moves, actually. So I'm going to do I'll go rook d6, king f3. I think I'm going to look at the engine. It's going to... In fact, everything's a draw now. But yeah, which means that this is a draw because of what I said, king e4. Only drawing move. Attack the rook, rook c4, king b3, and simultaneously defend your rook and attack the black rook. So if you didn't understand all those arrows on the board a minute ago, that's what I was doing. Right, that's everything on vertical cutoff. I think that video's gone on for a very long time, 50 minutes, but yeah, I hope we liked it.